living and their passion to help men who are who are in crisis, to help them to heal. So let's start off with John Davis, and I will be glad to read a short bio for John. John says men are committing suicide at up to 6 times the rate of women. There are 7 steps we must take to close the gap. So John was born in Cleveland, Ohio. He was educated at Case Western Reserve University, Seattle University School of Law, New York University School of Law, and then John is also fluent in 7 languages. You're going to be presenting in all 7. He has traveled the world over many times, has represented clients in his 35-year career, such as the United States government and the Federation of Russia. And he's been a prosecutor 3 times in his 35 years. He's also held positions such as Assistant Attorney General in various United States jurisdictions. Please welcome John Davis.
Thank you very much. Since we're pressed for time this morning, I'll skip preliminaries and get right into things. Suicide is, I think you've seen in the mainstream media, about a 3.5 to 1 problem in terms of a gender gap between men and women. It's actually much worse than that. We'll get into that in a little bit. I'm focused on men committing suicide for almost 35 years, and I'm currently writing a book about it. And I want to share with you some recent developments in neuroscience that apply specifically to men's issues. We don't have time to go into this, but we now have scientific confirmation in the last probably 5 to 10 years from neuroscience, genetics, psychiatry, that depression, which is the principal cause of suicide, is actually a physical illness. It's brain inflammation and the body's reaction to the brain inflammation. You've heard probably that depression is a chemical imbalance in the brain. Well, what causes that is when our immune system responds to the inflammation in the brain, it produces an enzyme that breaks down all of the chemicals that we need to function on a healthy basis. Rather than go into it because of the shortage of time, I do have a reference for you. It's a new book by Dr. Edward Fulmore. He's eminently qualified to write the book and present the medical science to lay people. He's chairman of psychiatry at the University of Cambridge, and he has laid out the specifics that we don't have time to cover today. So I'll give that to you as a reference. He's backed up. This is no longer speculation or hypothesis or fancy. It's backed up by many, many studies in neuroscience. I've read about 400 of them, and again, I refer you for the specifics on this, Dr. Fulmore's book, The Flame of Mind. When it comes to men, we also have from the field of genetics and molecular psychiatry, recent study in the last year that there are about 44 genomes involved in depression, and depression is by far the most common cause of suicide. In men, those 44 genes react in the exact opposite way as women. Okay? That's a very important scientific discovery. Everybody was suspicious when this report came out. Within a year, there had been over 40 studies done trying to disprove it. They all ended up confirming it. So men are biologically different from women when they're suffering depression. So what happens when men are depressed? Well, you can see a little list there. First of all, they're biologically compelled to substance abuse. Alcohol is particularly dangerous for men to use while they are depressed because alcohol tends to contribute to brain inflammation. Get into this a little bit later, but brain inflammation is caused by many, many things. It could be physical trauma, illness, substance abuses, exposure to neurotoxins, The most common reason that someone's brain becomes inflamed is prolonged stress over a period of time, and that's particularly true of men. So they may become socially isolated, socially dysfunctional. They'll engage in risk-taking behavior in response to depression and underlying brain inflammation. They'll be irritable, frequently excited to anger, and may become controlling, violent, or abusive. And that looks a lot to me like a list of things that people label as toxic masculinity, and possibly the man box, which you hear a lot about. I'm going to go on. Again, stress is probably the most common cause of brain inflammation. The body reacts to stress by creating substances that inflame the brain. Do you think maybe that men are under stress in our culture? Suicides by gender. I wish I had time because this graph should be self-explanatory. The blue area of the graph are men committing suicide. This is for 1 year. And the pink are women. In the 15 to 34 age group, it is the number 2 killer of men and boys. Okay? In the 15 to 24 age group, young teenagers, boys and young men, the gender suicide gap is actually 6 to 1. And in younger groups like this, it's not that younger lives are more valuable than older lives, but younger lives, we as a culture, society, as a race, lose many, many more years of human life when young people commit suicide. You can see that this graph of raw suicide deaths is heavily weighted toward the younger people. This is a quick look at the suicide gap over time. This is for a century, begins in 1900, ends in 2010. And you can see that gap spike in the 1960s. Does anyone have any idea what I might be thinking about what happened in the 60s that might have caused that spike? Let's listen to Candace Owens for 1 minute. She hits the nail on the head. We don't have audio.
She looks good though. She usually sounds good too.
I speak out against feminism because it's not feminism. What's happening today is a radical form of a women's movement. The idea that we don't need men, that men are always and constantly, once again, the oppressed versus the oppressor. I have news for people that do identify themselves as feminists. Men are not dropped off by the stork. They are born. We are the people that have to carry men for 9 months. They are our little boys, they are our sons, they are our husbands.
Let's skip it.
I speak out against feminism because it's not feminism. What's happening today is a radical form of a women's movement. The idea that we don't need men, that men are always and constantly, once again, the oppressed versus the oppressor. I have news for people that do identify dropped off by the stork. They are born. We are the people that have to carry men for 9 months. They are our little boys, they are our sons, they are our husbands. The idea that somebody can live a life in the way that Brett Kavanaugh has lived his life, and to have what has happened to him over these last couple of weeks happen to him should terrify everyone. This country needs due process, but beyond that, this country needs women to find their voices and to fight for our men. Because what is happening right now is a cultural war on men.
Let's talk a little bit about the cultural war on men and in the aftermath of that little clip. Really, I think we all owe a lot of thanks to the women who are trying to help us raise awareness and find solutions for men's problems. The cultural war on men that Candace is talking about, I think we all know what she was referring to. And it causes relentless stress on men. These able professionals here deal with it on a day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute basis, trying to help men. And it's something we need to address at a much higher level, a political level, and a media level. I'm going to pass through this, but the one picture says, when you constantly tell boys to hate their own gender. And I was alive when we didn't have feminism, and became alarmed and stressed myself over the last 50 years. When you tell boys to hate their own gender, some will eventually take your advice. And I think that has a lot to do with what's behind men's stress, the underlying and resolving depression, and the suicide gender gap. Let's take a quick look at the media political problem that we have. It's very passive aggressive. This is an actual screen clip from the HuffPost titled, "There's been a startling rise in suicide rates in the U.S., particularly for women." Well, if you look at this, the rate for women suicides are about 8 per 100,000. For men, it's 28 per 100,000. But this is a problem particularly for women. Not only that, the graph is accelerating for men faster than it is for women. We really do have a political, public relations, propaganda problem. And that, I believe, is what's driving men into depression. We are silent as the suicide gap between men and women is accelerating 4.5 times overall. That was the last statistics that I took from last year. If men are the privileged class, they're only 40% of college graduates, they're 55% of domestic violence victims, 75% of the homeless, 80% of suicide victims, 95% of workplace deaths, and the suicide rate in the United States now, 22 veteran suicide per day, is 4 times the rate of combat deaths. And then we have forced circumcision. No one will ever tell me that does not cause trauma for boys. Let's get through that quickly. Okay, this touches, I'm going to go through this quickly because this touches on Siobhan Maier's talk this afternoon about force to penetrate issues. And this book was written by Dr. Miriam Denoff. She's currently a professor at McGill University. She wrote this as her doctoral thesis at Cambridge in 2000, and she came to the conclusion that female sex offending is far more common than we're willing to admit as a culture. Now these are according to gender-neutral studies, and there have been very few gender-neutral studies done. The United States did its first gender-neutral study in 2013. According to that study, 50% of boys will have been sexually assaulted by the time they are 18 years old. Dr. Blair Stemple at UCLA Law School meta-analyzed the federal data from that gender-neutral study, found that 95% of the perpetrators of sexual assault of boys were female, blowing away all the stereotyps. You'll hear all kinds of figures, and they're distorted figures from gender-specific studies. Take the gender-neutral ones, and the fact is that men and women are sexually assaulted in equal numbers in any given year. That's a huge stereotype to pierce through. And that's a huge problem for boys and men. Boys don't even recognize that they have a history of sexual assault because it's rarely explored in any professions or institutions or anywhere else. And Dr. Larry Stempel's study was in 2016. Again, and I don't want to dwell on this because I think Siobhan Muir is going to cover it. But more than 50% of male survivors of sexual assault, and there are over 1 million a year, report suicidal thoughts. Over 20% attempt suicide. We need to start addressing this problem in a way that's specific to men and boys and helpful to men and boys. I'm going to really breeze through this. Depression comes on a very broad scale. Some depression you can treat with antidepressants. Antidepressants are only effective statistically about 20 to 25% of the time. If the physician addresses the underlying brain inflammation in depression, the antidepressant's efficacy goes from 20 to 25% to over 75%. That's sometimes just giving anti-inflammatory medicine with the antidepressants. And I really don't have the time to get into this. This is more in these other area of these other distinguished professionals, so I'm going to let them cover it. And in suicide, critical suicide, we now have the ability to block the enzyme that's destroying the neurotransmitters in the brain that destruction causes depression. And men do not respond well in depression to cognitive therapy, traditional therapy. They do respond to something called situational distress therapy, which was developed for AIDS patients, and is much more effective in treating them. Move on. So I've got a list of 7 things, and I'm just going to breeze through them. I'm sure you all know the thoughts. First, stop the media war on men and boys. I've just appalled over the last 50 years how I've seen how men and false stereotypes are exploited in Hollywood, television, and in the news stories. Stop the war on men and boys in institutions. I think one of the reasons that we have a concentration of suicide in the younger age groups is those are the age groups where men and boys have the most contact with our institutions. Our institutions are now, designed to promote misandry, gynocentrism, and androphobia. We need to stop them. Stop female sex predators from abusing men and boys. I think we need to begin prosecuting or addressing the problem as vigorously and zealously as we went after men for the reciprocal. We need to fund medical research for depression in men. These new scientific discoveries are well known among the experts, but not well known among the general medical community or the psychotherapy community. We need research and dissemination of the information widely. Give men the reproductive rights. I don't want to put a chart up here, but when men are alienated from their children or a spouse, even in divorce, major factor in depression, doubles the probability of depression. So we need to give men their reproductive rights. The last one is stop lawmakers and judges from destroying men. After 35 years as a trial lawyer, the worst enemies that men have are male judges. I'm going to tell you that right now. But the whole system is geared to destroy men. They're very valid studies that show that men receive 67% higher sentences than women for the exact same crimes. We need to stop that on all levels and in all categories. Real quick, I did a little research, and there are text suicide hotlines and toll-free hotlines for Canada for anyone who is suicidal, and there's your toll-free number, and you can also text if 45645 if you don't feel comfortable talking on the phone. So that's all I had today. I'm going to turn it over to my learned colleagues, and thank you very much for allowing me to share.
Eric Peary is a registered psychotherapist at the College of Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario, and he's a certified sex addiction therapist with the International Institute for Trauma and Addiction Professionals. He holds a master's degree in psychotherapy and a Bachelor of Commerce, and he opened Men Therapy Toronto, counseling and psychotherapy services for men with the intention of making psychotherapy accessible to men. So he's a perfect guest to address today's topic. Eric.